James's father pushed him to the edge, and James ran, away from the pressure, the pain, and the expectations he could no longer bear. But while the world watched him disappear, Diep stayed. She didn't chase, didn't beg, didn't demand answers. She waited, through the silence, through the doubt, through nights filled with unanswered prayers. In her quiet endurance, love revealed its truest form, not in escape, but in the courage to remain when everything else falls apart. On some mornings, the world feels quiet in a way that is almost cruel. The sun still rises, the streets still breathe with ordinary footsteps, yet somewhere inside a family, a storm has already passed, leaving silence behind. This was how James's story began, not with shouting. Mother's voice had always been firm, sharp, like iron struck against stone. "I know what's best for you," his father would say, not unkindly, but without space for doubt. And for years, James believed it. He followed the path laid out for him, carried expectations heavier than his own dreams, and learned to swallow his questions before they could turn into words. Then Diep appeared, quiet, steady, nothing like the world James had known. She did not demand answers or shape his future with commands. She listened. She waited. With her, James felt something dangerously unfamiliar, the freedom to breathe. Love, he realized, was not a cage but a place to rest. That was when the conflict began. James's father saw Diep not as a person, but as a disruption. Love, in his eyes, was a weakness. Waiting was foolish. Sacrifice was unnecessary. He tightened his grip, pushed harder, raised his voice when James hesitated. Every conversation turned into a test. Every silence became an accusation. And slowly, painfully, James felt himself breaking. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way a tree cracks before it falls. One night, with no plan and no courage left to argue, James ran away. He left behind a house full of rules, a father full of unspoken fear, and a life that no longer felt like his own. He thought distance would heal him. He believed escape was the same as freedom. But running only taught him how heavy loneliness could be. Each unfamiliar street reminded him of everything he had not resolved, everything he had abandoned. Diep stayed. She stayed where memories waited. She stayed where hope hurt. While James hid from the weight of his father's control, Diep carried the weight of waiting, without promises, without certainty. She did not chase James or demand explanations. She simply believed that love, if real, could endure silence. In the ordinary rhythm of daily life, meals cooked, nights growing colder, time moving forward, Diep waited. And somewhere far away, James felt it. The quiet pull of someone who had not left, even when leaving would have been easier. Sometimes, the hardest journeys are not made by those who run away, but by those who choose to stay. Running away did not bring James the peace he had imagined. At first, there was relief, the kind that comes when pressure suddenly disappears, like silence after a storm. He woke up in unfamiliar rooms, worked with strangers, and learned how to live with only what he could carry. His days became simple: wake up early, work until his hands ached, eat whatever was cheap and warm. Life moved forward in small, ordinary steps, yet something inside him remained painfully still. At night, when the city lights dimmed and the world slowed down, his thoughts always drifted back to Diep. He wondered how she was spending her evenings. Was she still making tea before bed? Was she still looking out the window when the night grew quiet? James told himself that she deserved better than a man who ran instead of fought, and yet that thought hurt more than the cold floors he slept on or the exhaustion in his bones. Love, he realized, does not fade just because distance demands it to. Meanwhile, Diep's life continued in a different rhythm. She woke up every morning with responsibilities waiting for her, with small tasks that left no space for despair. She worked, she cared, she smiled when needed. To others, she looked calm, strong even. But strength, she learned, is often misunderstood. It is not the absence of pain, but the decision to carry it quietly. People around her asked questions. Why don't you move on? Why do you wait? Diep never gave long answers. How could she explain that waiting was not weakness, that love was not something she could abandon simply because it became difficult? In her heart, she believed that James was not running away from her, but from a life that had never allowed him to choose. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Sometimes Diep would hear James's name unexpectedly, in a song, in a conversation, in the sound of footsteps that weren't his. Each moment stirred a familiar ache, but also a quiet hope. She did not know where James was or when he would return. She only knew that if he ever did, she wanted to meet him as the same woman he had left behind, steady, patient, unchanged by bitterness. And James, in his loneliness, began to understand what his father had never taught him. Power could force obedience, but it could not earn loyalty. Fear could control actions, but it could not hold a heart. The further James traveled from his past, the clearer one truth became. Diep had not stayed because she was weak. She stayed because she was brave. Somewhere between their separate lives, an invisible thread remained unbroken. Neither could see it, but both could feel it. And slowly, James began to realize that running had never been the solution. The real challenge, the one he had avoided, was finding the courage to return, not as a son fleeing control, but as a man ready to choose his own life. The turning point came quietly, the way most life-changing moments do. There was no dramatic announcement, no sudden miracle. It arrived on an ordinary morning, wrapped in something painfully familiar. James was standing in line at a small bakery, the smell of warm bread filling the air, when he noticed a young couple arguing in hushed voices. The man looked tired, defensive. The woman looked patient, but her eyes carried the same silent waiting James had seen in Diep's. That was when it hit him. Running had taught him how to survive, but not how to live. He stepped outside with his coffee, the cup trembling slightly in his hands. For months, he had told himself that distance was a form of protection, that staying away would keep Diep safe from his family, from his broken past. But the truth felt heavier now. Absence could hurt just as deeply as control. Love left unanswered becomes doubt, and doubt slowly turns into loneliness. That evening, James finally called home. His father's voice was as firm as ever, sharp with expectations and unspoken commands. The conversation ended the same way it always had, without understanding, without warmth. But this time something was different. James did not feel smaller when the call ended. He felt clearer. He understood that he could not heal a fractured bond by disappearing, nor could he protect Diep by erasing himself from her life. Back home, Diep was living through her own quiet storm. Waiting had begun to feel heavier, not because her love was fading, but because uncertainty is exhausting. Some nights she questioned herself. Was she holding on to hope, or simply afraid of letting go? The line between the two blurred more often than she wanted to admit. Then, one afternoon, her phone rang. James's name appeared on the screen, and for a brief second the world seemed to pause. Her heart raced, then stilled. She did not answer immediately. She closed her eyes, took a breath, and reminded herself that love did not mean losing herself. When she finally picked up, her voice was calm, steady, strong in a way she had earned. They spoke carefully, like two people walking across thin ice. James did not make promises. He did not ask for forgiveness. He simply told her the truth, that he was tired of running, that he was afraid, and that he missed her more than he knew how to explain. Diep listened, and in that listening, something shifted. She did not rush him back. She did not beg him to return. She only said, "When you're ready to come back as yourself." That sentence stayed with James long after the call ended. For the first time, the path forward did not feel forced or frightening. It felt chosen. Outside, the sky darkened, lights flickered on, and life continued in its ordinary rhythm. But somewhere between two hearts that had never truly let go, the distance began to shrink, not through urgency, but through understanding. The night James decided to return was not marked by thunder or signs from the sky. It was quiet, almost too quiet, like the calm that comes before a long-awaited truth. He stood by the window of his small rented room, watching the street below where people hurried home with groceries, laughter, and ordinary worries. In that moment, he understood something simple yet profound. Life was not asking him to be perfect, only to be present. The journey back felt longer than the one when he ran away. Every mile carried memories, his father's stern voice, Diep's silent patience, the promises he had made but never fully kept. Fear traveled with him, sitting beside hope, neither overpowering the other. That balance, fragile and honest, was new. When James finally stood at the familiar gate, his hands hesitated before knocking. Inside, Diep was folding clothes, lost in routine, the kind people use to distract themselves from missing someone. The knock startled her. For a brief second, she considered ignoring it. Life had taught her caution, but something in her chest urged her forward. When she opened the door, time seemed to fold in on itself. James stood there, thinner, quieter, but unmistakably real. No grand speech followed, no dramatic apology. He simply said her name, and that was enough. Sometimes, love does not need explanations, only truth standing in front of you. They sat together in silence, the kind that once felt painful, but now felt safe. James spoke of his father, not with anger, but with acceptance. He admitted he might never change the man who raised him, but he could change the way he lived under that shadow. Diep listened, not as someone waiting anymore, but as someone choosing. Outside, Nee's laughter drifted in from the yard, light and unburdened. She ran towards James, arms open, as if nothing had ever been broken. He knelt down, holding her tightly, feeling something inside him finally settle. In that embrace, he realized what he had been searching for all along was not escape, but belonging. Life did not suddenly become easy after that night. The past did not disappear. James still had conversations to face, responsibilities to carry, and fears to confront. But now, he was no longer alone in them. As the evening deepened, Diep poured tea, the steam rising slowly between them. It was an ordinary scene, 3 people under one roof, sharing quiet moments. Yet it held a quiet power, the kind that mirrors real life. Not every battle is loud. Not every victory is dramatic. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stop running, return home, and choose love. Not as a promise of perfection, but as a commitment to stay.